So if we're back to the concept of adolescence, one of the things that I want to make sure that you understand is that the age range of adolescence has dramatically changed over the years. Adolescent, which we always associate with a teenager, typically would be 13 to 19. And for many, many years in the field of psychology, that was the cohort that we were referring to when we talked about teenagers and adolescents. But now, because of the advent of good nutrition and girls being able to menstruate as young as 10 years old, we now have dramatically expanded that frame, that timeline of adolescence. And because we also now know that the adolescent brain is not fully myelinated until 26 years old, that also has contributed to the expansion of this definition of adolescence. So adolescence really is 10 to 26. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And aside from the first year of life, where we actually do the most amount of growth and change that we do in our lifetime, we do that in our first year of life. And I mentioned my other grandson who's 9 months old, and I get this extraordinary picture now of the amazing amount of change that is happening in Jonah's body and his abilities, in the 9 months that he's been on this planet. It's amazing, starting from being this immobile, little being to, crawling and saying words and laughing. And it's just extraordinary how much growth happens in the first year of life. But adolescence is the second time of the most amount of change that we experience in our lifetimes. And that change is biological, and it's neurological, and it's physical, and it's emotional. There's a lot that's going on. So we know that it is it can be a very turbulent time for many, many teenagers. Again, even kids who are growing up in safe families, and did get secure attachment. We also know that the predominant developmental milestone is identity, right? Identity versus role confusion. And without getting political, I'm just going to say that in this day and age, teenagers, I would say, have more of a struggle. It's a little bit more of a confusing time. When they're told to reevaluate the gender that they're going to be, or their sexual preference, or lots of other things about who they are. For some kids, this is obviously a blessing, and it's important that they're supported in that. But I've worked with a lot of teenagers who've actually said, I feel like there's something wrong with me because I'm not questioning my gender. And that's really interesting. And so there is this preoccupation with identity and with self and who am I, and beginning that process of individuation, and who am I separate from my parents and separate from who my parents tell me I am, right? Separate from who my parents want me to be. So of course there is a lot of preoccupation with self, because these kids are desperately trying to figure out who they are and how they're going to be in the world, and what their peer relationships are going to look like. And, kids in this day and age have very complicated decisions that I'm 65 years old. I didn't have to make a lot of the decisions because the internet didn't exist. And, a lot of the things that kids have access to now, I had the great luxury of growing up with a lot of protection and a lot of naivete, frankly, because I wasn't exposed to certain things that very young kids can potentially be exposed to. So there's a lot of decision making and choices. Am I going to get high? Am I going to become sexually active at 10? Am I going to get into the car with a friend who is driving, who is drunk? Am I going to steal the exam? Am I, on and on and on. Am I going to look at the video, of somebody being shot and murdered, on YouTube? Really, really impactful choices and decisions. And unfortunately, those decisions are being made from an adolescent brain. They're really not being made from a fully myelinated adult brain. So I just want to say something about the adolescent brain. And again, if you're working with teenagers, I think it's valuable to give them some of this information and to begin to connect it to some of the impulsivity, perhaps around some of their self-destructive behavior. So the adolescent brain is wired for 4 fundamental things: pleasure-seeking, aggression, impulsivity, and risk-taking. Whoa. Think about the confluence of those 4 things: aggression, pleasure-seeking, impulsivity, and risk-taking. And so you're working and, you're doing a family session with a 16-year-old who, the parents report has done something stupid, and the parents are yelling at the kids saying, "What were you thinking?" And the answer is they weren't. They weren't operating from the executive functioning, reasoning, cause and effect analysis, judgment part of their brain. They were operating from, this is going to be fun. This will get me connected to more friends. This will make me more popular, right? This will meet the need that I have right now, this second, in this moment. The adolescent brain is literally not able to extrapolate out and think about the long-term effect of choices that it's making. And that's a really important thing for parents to understand, so they're not shaming their kids. It's also important that parents understand that, therefore, they have to stay very proactive in their kids' lives. It's almost like the child and the teenager need to borrow the executive functioning of an adult prefrontal cortex. So the adolescent brain is constantly seeking novelty, which on the one hand is a lovely, lovely thing. Kids are far more willing to take a risk than adults are. That's actually been proven. But the problem is that the risks that they take may not be commensurate with their brain's capacity to process what they have witnessed. And again, in this day and age, a lot of what younger kids' brains are being exposed to are things that are sexualized and things that are violent. And you see that showing up in the video gaming that they're doing. And unfortunately, the access they have to anything and everything on the internet and, YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and every other platform that's out there. And the truth is that technology is here and our brains are here. This is true for adult brains as well. And so we have been bombarded with this extraordinary amount of overstimulation and visceral imagery that our brains literally don't know how to handle. And the adolescent brain absolutely does not know now how to handle it. And so as an aside, this is why we're also seeing a very dramatic uptick in adolescents who have sleep disturbance and night terrors, and teenagers who seem to be more depressed and more anxious, and then turning to self-destructive behavior as a way to try to self-soothe and self-medicate. So these things, again, they all kind of are intertwined, and these are lots of puzzle pieces that you can connect with your client, with the families that you're working with. We also know that the adolescent brain responds differently to very emotionally loaded imagery and situations than an adult brain would, or even a child's brain. The adolescent brain is particularly vulnerable, particularly sensitive to emotional overload and to emotional stress. And again, they need to be able to lean into and lean on the comfort and the support of an adult brain. Sometimes it's not going to be a parent. It might be a teacher. It might be a coach. It might be the director of the school play. And that's great. I mean, sometimes it needs to be a surrogate. But we really have to make sure that teenagers have adult mentors and surrogates and grown-ups that they can turn to, who are healthy, who are safe, who are reliable and consistent. Because again, if you leave an adolescent to their own devices, much of the time, it's a recipe for disaster. You all know countless stories, I'm sure, of the parents who go away for the weekend and they leave the 16-year-old alone in the house. 16-year-old has great grades. They're very trustworthy. Is anybody surprised that over that weekend, 50 other 16-year-olds came in and drank the alcohol and wrecked the living room? See, we can't be surprised by stuff like that. That's an adolescent brain that's operating from impulsivity, pleasure-seeking, risk-taking, and aggression. I mean, there it is. And so again, I don't want to pathologize it. This is normal. This is where the adolescent brain is at. The adolescent brain also responds differently to alcohol. And what we do know from a lot of research is that the younger a teenager is when they start drinking, the more likely they will go on to develop a serious problem and addiction to alcohol. We also, it's not on this slide, but I give a separate training on the use of marijuana, because it's, I think, a mental health crisis. And a new study just came out that teenagers are 5 times more likely to develop psychosis if they are using marijuana with any regularity. The amount of THC in the products that they're accessing is sometimes toxic. So, the adolescent brain cannot process the kind of substances that it's being given and exposed to. So why is the adolescent brain different? Just to very quickly kind of give you this answer. It has everything to do with the essential growth process called myelination. And I want you to think about myelination the way you would think about a rubber coating over a copper wire. So if you have a copper wire that has no coating on it, the electricity is going to flow through kind of irregularly and not as efficiently and not as quickly. When you put a sort of rubber coating over that wire, it magically fires more effectively, more efficiently, more quickly. That's myelination. And that's the exact process that's happening in our brains, that these neurons need to get this process of myelination so that the firing can happen effectively, efficiently, and more quickly. Now, because we're wired to survive, the myelination process always starts at the back of the brain stem, which is the most primitive part of our brain. Because we need that to be able to work efficiently. The brain stem that connects to the spinal cord, the brain stem is responsible for our ability to breathe and to go to the bathroom and to go to sleep and to wake up. So that's essential. The next part of the brain that myelinates is the limbic system, where we do fight, flight, freeze. And that's necessary for survival. It's also the sensory emotional part of the brain. The last part of the brain is way up here in the front, the prefrontal cortex, where we do all of our executive functioning. And from a biological evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense because we don't need to do high thinking to survive. We just need to be able to run, right? We need to be able to fight back, and we need to be able to breathe. So the last part of the brain that myelinates is the most evolved part of the brain. This is where we have impulse control. This is where we do cause and effect reasoning, judgment, analysis. It's also where we have empathy. And again, this is not going to fully myelinate until the mid-20s, usually about 24 for girls and as late as 26 for boys. This was a great breakthrough discovery, and we didn't know any of this stuff about the brain until 2004 when neuroscientists were able to actually use, functional MRIs and PET scans. Before that, they were never able to study a brain that was actually functioning. You can only, take out a piece of a brain that had already, a person had already died. So having this information, I think, is really, really helpful. The adolescent, again, part of their developmental milestone is individuating. So they're looking for autonomy, they're looking for control. But when teenagers are super honest, they will tell you that they don't know what they're doing. And it takes a lot of courage, frankly, for a teenager to admit to that. And so instead, they will often lead with a lot of bravado. Right? It's not real. They don't really feel confident fully. They don't really know fully what they're doing, but they're so hell-bent to, individuate from their parents that they will not ask for the parental advice when they need it. And that's something that can really get them into trouble.